You're listening to Culture 360, the podcast that takes you inside the world of workplace and team culture. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide, as we explore the ideas, people, and stories shaping the way we work, lead, and connect. So please subscribe, sit back, relax, and enjoy culture from every angle. Hello, good people, and welcome to the Culture 360 podcast in association with the Culture Room. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide. Well, it's another first today for episode 5. This podcast is being recorded online between here in New Zealand and the UK with a good friend of mine, an assistant principal at Bridgewater High School in the leafy suburb of Appleton, Warrington, Mr. Duncan Morrison. Welcome to the Culture 360 podcast, Duncan.
Good evening and good morning, Stu. That's the best description I've ever heard of Warrington, by the way, so that was beautiful. Wait till you hear this.
Leafy suburbs of Appleton. It's an early start here, mate, so I've got the coffee on the go, and I thought you were cracking a beer, but it looks like it's a can of Pepsi Max, which is good. Yeah, no sugar. I think cards on the table for anybody listening straight out the gate. We've known each other for probably about 20 years and bonded over the great game of rugby league. And you came and volunteered and did a lot of great work and coaching and volunteering for us. And the last time I saw you physically, we went backpacking or traveling, should we say, for about 4 to 6 weeks in Aussie. And the last time I saw you physically, I think you were disappearing at the airport gate wearing a New South Wales rugby shirt and some, what they call here, jandals. You call them flip-flops. And never to be seen again. That was 2006 in August.
Yeah.
So almost 20 years ago, 19 years ago. But I think for the sake of the listener, do you want to give us a little bit about your background? Because obviously you've been a teacher and you're now an assistant principal in secondary school in Warrington, Northwest England. So just give us a little bit of a synopsis on yourself.
Yeah, so Stu, I started out working in universities, and then I saved up, went travelling for the very, very first time way back when. And it actually, ironically, it links to your current geographical location, because I was on a balcony watching the ships in New Zealand, and my friend was sat next to me and he said, "What are you going to do when you go back home?" Because I had no money, credit cards maxed out. I was going back to live in my mum's. He said, "You know what? You'd be a good teacher." And I thought, okay, I'll do a bit of inquiring, and then that was it. So that was 2005. Started out teaching and then quickly went through the sort of leadership ranks within teaching. Always had a sort of thirst for people, and always got on well with individuals and all different types of individuals. It was one of my skills, I suppose. And then that sort of led me to where I am today. So I'm an assistant, we call him assistant head teacher. I do a lot of work with other schools in the Northwest. So we do a lot of what's called RISE partnerships, which is where we go into schools that are looking for school-to-school support, and we go out and we help them improve. So yeah, I'm really lucky actually, and I've been really lucky with the opportunities I've had since we waved ourselves off in 2006. And I remember you actually influenced the tears because you were sorry to see me go.
I think it's just your infectious personality, Dunk. That's what it was. It was I was on my own then, having to find my way in the world, and 6 months of traveling around. And that's the first time I actually came to New Zealand. Believe it or not, I came over here for a month. I came to Wellington and I thought, if I ever get a chance to move over here and work here, I'll jump at the chance. And lo and behold, it worked out that way for me. So in terms of your role, obviously you've got a lot of experience in teaching and now in the management area. Just breaking down your role. So you're still teaching in the classroom.
Yeah.
Part of your role. But part of your role is also taking on developing the school.
Yeah, so I teach. Yeah, I teach. I'm also the safeguarding lead and do a lot of the climate work within my own school, and then I am lucky enough to get out into other schools and other settings, and they're all different settings from all different value backgrounds, and we get the opportunity to go in and make change and have impact. It is fantastic. Yeah, it's really, really good.
What gives you that buzz or the pull or the push each day? Because you've been in education for maybe 20, 25 years now, and you still get up with the same passion and drive for the job and management.
Yeah. Teaching like it's just different every single day. And when in thinking about driving home tonight, when I was thinking about what we were going to be talking about tonight, one of the questions that people always ask is, like, cultures in school and how do you get that stability within climates. And actually, it is really difficult because schools are like continually shifting landscapes. Every year you get 360 newbies and you lose 360 the other end. So, that's actually the hardest part of teaching because it's that continual process of reinvention and adapting to different people in different times. That's actually the bit that keeps you fresh. Like, so having been in the teaching game for like 20 odd years, I still feel fresh and still have like the challenge to want to do things. And ultimately, Stu, what better, I can't think of a better job like than, shaping kids' futures. And it sounds corny that, but that's why we do it. Like, it's such rewarding work. And when you can do that on a whole school level, well, that is really, really entertaining on a personal level. Like,
You mentioned two words there. You mentioned culture and climate. Is there a difference between those two things and what you're trying to achieve through your role?
yeah, so they're kind of independent, aren't they? I mean, I know you do a lot of work with culture around the globe, really, with all the different. I mean, I've listened with interest to your previous podcasts and kept an eye on what you've been doing. And schools culture really is like sort of. Look, you read loads of books, you'll get different answers. But for me, like school culture is the kind of mesh. So it's the rules, it's the attitudes, it's the beliefs, it's the perceptions, it's the relationships. That's the culture. And the climate is what's created by those sort of things that make a school, So I suppose a climate is, ultimately people use phrases like, what it feels like here. But I would say it's like what makes you really want to come back day in, day out. That's what the climate is. But the culture is what creates the climate.
It's always interesting to get that definition. I think I was chatting to James a couple of weeks ago on episode 4, and he described it as a vibe, an environment. And you hit on a phrase there. It's the way we do things around here, which is kind of the stock standard answer for culture. Do you think what you're trying to build within your environment, within your cultural climate, if you like, is different for teachers and students, or is it the same vision, the same purpose and vision where you're trying to get to?
So the climate, like, that is a cliched way of the way we do things around here. I mean, I teach philosophy A level, or at least I did in a previous role. And, from a philosophical point of view, it's not so much the way we do things. I quite like the idea of the rules of the club. So the rules of the club are the same for everybody in the club. So whether you be a parent, whether you be part of the premises team, whether you be a teacher, whether you're the head teacher, whether you're a pupil, the climate is the rules of the club, and it's our club and it's our rules, but they have to be agreed on by all. That's the way I would describe it. I don't know whether you've ever heard it sort of put like that before, but I think that for me, from a philosophical point of view, because like, looking at sort of philosophies about what makes reality, and, the modern view of that is that we have billions of different realities and we make our own reality. So the rules of a club is like the rules of the game. We might all do assessments, but we call them different things. One school might call them end of year tests. The other ones might call them quality mark assessments. Doesn't matter. They're just the rules to our club.
So the environment or the culture you're trying to create within your school can be very different to a school just down the road, because obviously the UK is quite diverse and it's probably a little bit different in terms of the way it's set up to New Zealand. But do you share ideas across schools, or is it very different in your school to another school?
Well, I would say that I suppose the sort of overarching principle of any school is to get the best outcomes for young people. With that though, there's a bit of a risk of becoming like an exam factory.
Okay.
So realistically, what, most schools now adopt a more holistic approach. I would argue that it's easier to do that from sort of for a Christian background, because like, to create a culture around the saints, for example, from a Catholic background, or, it's quite easy to do that. Service, is an easy sort of cultural belief to hang your hat on. It's much harder to develop that in like a primary school or a secondary school that from a non-faith background, because then all you've really got is this idea that you want the best outcomes, but outcomes aren't everything, are they? It's about creating the whole pupil. And I think that's where gets a bit more challenging and a bit more interesting when we start to look at values and beliefs of schools.
That question did pop up for me when you were just making that statement then, just around values. And I think we've had this conversation before around like if schools are grounded more in the religious side of things, do you see them more value driven or having those values sort of enforced on them more than what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, look, so we do a lot of work in faith schools, as part of our trust. So we'll go out to all different settings. There's a school that I'm thinking of now, which is a lovely school in the Wirral, in Liverpool, and it's got like as you turn the corner and you approach the school, it's got this beautiful sort of mural on the wall of the Virgin Mary, and it's very much like from a South American sort of graffiti vibe. And as you turn the corner and you look at the school, you get this big message, this big value statement. There's no words on it. It's just like the Virgin Mary. And I think in some ways I get a bit envious of working in when I go to church schools, because I think, wow, it'd be so much easier to develop that in our school, because actually sometimes when you take on a load of, 11-year-olds and then you're trying to instill in them new values that to them just don't seem connected, even if they're not complicated ideas like, kindness, or whether it's, I don't know, whether you talk about, integrity. It's quite difficult to get a kid to put them all together and think this is what makes me a better person. But then if you've got stories to tell and you've got artifacts, like, I know you spend a lot of time looking at that kind of stuff in your work, not so much me. I think it makes it easier. So I get a bit envious around those sort of, it's kind of, I'm not suggesting it's like a pot noodle, but it's that kind of, it's an instant meal, really. It's a bit of water and off you go. And I think for some principals and some schools in the last 20 years, they've had to really think about, the beliefs. What does it mean to really be us? And I think that's quite difficult for schools, that.
I think you've hit on a few things there. Like we were chatting earlier about, I'd just been to Lisbon and we were chatting about Benfica Football Club and some of the artifacts there when you walk into that stadium. And obviously they've got an emblem or a logo, which is the eagle. And you're talking about schools that are obviously more of a faith distinction. And as a parent, you're looking at that and you know what you're going to get when you walk into the physical building and you have those artifacts on the wall. If you're talking about your school to either parents or the teachers, how do you describe your school in terms of the culture? Like, what do you say if you had to sum it up in one sentence and you were, not that you do, but you were given it a hard sell in a parent teacher interview or something like that outside the school gates, what would you say?
I suppose that's really quite difficult. I mean, in our school, we have like a set of values. And when we talk about values in our school, I mean, I know we'll probably touch on this in a bit, but, you should be able to just feel them. It should be something that's, so overtly obvious that they should pick up on that as they come. Now, we've just recently had our open evening. And I think, when I was speaking to the colleagues at the end of the night, we were talking about how did it feel? Because, recruitment's a big deal for schools, and, a lot of parents that we spoke to on the way out spoke about the warmth from the evening. And I suppose if you think about that, it's those little things that you do that sort of shape the culture of the school that people feel. So like I did mention before that, for school culture, one of the big parts of school culture is those relationships, those millions of conversations that people have every single day, day in, day out. They're some of the small things that shape the culture of a place and then ultimately affect the climate. So when we have parents' evening, I would suggest that instead of saying to people, quite happily list off the values, but I think that what they feel is more important.
How would you ensure that from a management point of view? I mean, you're assistant principal, you're also in the classroom doing some hands-on teaching with students. But how do you do that day to day? I guess we're sort of heading into the realm of values and rituals within culture. How do you ensure that at your school?
So there's lots of things you can do regarding teacher practice. So, there's that relational sort of CBD work you can do, about theories of action around, the importance of, authentic relationships, and that's really what we're talking about. When we talk about the things that we see in school, we're talking about that everything from, the listening that children feel they're listened to, or, just checking in with pupils, smiling with people. It's really difficult in our school to sort of maintain that because our school's a split site school. So there's a lot of travel between sites. There's a lot of rushing round. So a lot of that you'd expect to see in the classroom from teachers. So from a leadership point of view, when we do our sort of walkabouts around the site, one of the priorities that we look for in the classroom is those interactions, those positive sort of interactions.
I guess the challenge you have it's kind of like a large organization in terms of building culture when you in employment. You've got a lot of subcultures. So you're trying to build the school environment, but then within that, you've got obviously different classrooms, which are like different teams, if you like. So it's ensuring that obviously that all that's connected in the group hug. So how would you do that with staff? Like obviously trying to roll out the whole school culture, bringing the teachers into the fold so they can obviously carry that forward.
Yeah. So we have within any school, any sort of teachers who are listening to this will appreciate the, the work that goes on behind the scenes when it comes to CPD. What I would suggest, what we do is it's having those sort of we've recently adopted a new sort of CPD format where we have like rubrics. So like in so much as if you were doing an essay for your masters or whatever, you have what looks like a criteria for good work, a rubric. We've actually created them within our school. So we've had 5 theories of action this year, one of which is relational practice. And what we do is we have a checklist that what we're looking for, so there is no vague, because your idea and my idea of what a good relationship looks like, is fairly subjective. So we've actually been really bespoke with the staff, and we've told them exactly what it is that we expect to see from a colleague who's experiencing success in the classroom when it comes to those to the point whereby we even script questions in the classroom and also have a map laid out around the room in which that we will walk to check those vulnerable pupils and those pupils that we are concerned about. And it's that sort of attention to detail that we've put into our CPD programs, which it's been quite a shock really for the staff body, I think, in so much, but they've also really enjoyed it because there is no wriggle room. There is pretty much, this is what we want to happen.
It's almost quite scripted. Would that be like a lesson plan?
Yeah, well, it's part of, it's like that, but it just says, this is what good practice looks like. This is what outstanding practice looks like. And so the difference between, an authentic relationship is something that, I use the example when I'm sort of lecturing the trainee teachers about, when you sit next to somebody on a plane that you don't know for the first half an hour, it's fairly awkward, So like relationships aren't like, they are awkward until they're built. So it's that kind of drip, drip, drip that we always talk to the staff about. And there's a lot of really good research and a lot of good work around that for teachers. I'm thinking of Paul Dix, who's an author who's written a book on one of the chapters is this idea of botheredness, he calls it, where it's like proving to the kids that you're bothered. And in your head, you're probably like, oh, really? Like as if you care. But actually those little micro conversations that you have every day and that you build into your routines around, so little Stu Savage comes into my classroom, his shirt's untucked. I am going to challenge him about his shirt being untucked, but I'm probably going to ask him something about him that I know. I might say, how do you feel about Man United getting beat again at the weekend? And even though he hates the fact that I support Liverpool and little Stu Savage is a Man United fan, actually we've got an authentic relationship cemented in the fact that I asked him and I care. And it's those little nuances and it's, expecting things to be awkward to start with, but understanding that authentic relationships are built on the drip, drip, drip effect. And that's when it's done well. When it's done badly, teachers, that's the teacher who demands respect, doesn't give it to instantly and then can't believe it when it blows up in the face. And there's, the kids are swearing or the kids are being removed from lessons, so it cuts both ways.
So there's some micro moments and rituals at play every day, aren't there, in the classroom and in the corridors? And you're talking about building that relationship just through those touch points and moments with students. I was reading some of the research that you flicked my way a couple of weeks ago about building relationships and how important that is within the school environment. And staff understanding how relationships are built. Obviously, that's through some education, and you've obviously been part of that, like delivering to teachers, teaching teachers to teach. But how important is that in terms of understanding how to build relationships with students and in the classroom from a staff perspective?
It's like the most important thing we do. There's a document that comes from Central, from the DFE, and it's called it's Creating School Climate. It's actually, there's 3 R's. So the first one's routines, the second one's relationships, and the third one is responses. So basically, what is it? What does your classroom look like? Or what are your routines like? The relationships that you get to inform, because people don't do things for people they don't like, right? You know that, don't you, Stu? So you only do things with people you like, right? So, and then what to do when it goes wrong. So the response. So when Stewie doesn't do what he's told them, what? So the 3 R's, we call them in the ITT, initial teacher training world, but they are like the cornerstones of what it means to be an adult who works in a school. Like, the 3 R's. So yeah, it's like, and of the 3 R's, it's the most important. It's the most important.
I think something we've tried to crack through some of this work and stuff I consistently try to tease out is building those environments. We go back to building climates and cultures and how important relationships are. But then we hear this phrase, building a sense of belonging, which obviously includes connection and community. And it's always interesting to ask that question from different people in different industries, how they build relationships and build this sense of belonging. So we've had conversations in the past of how do you make students feel part of this institution we call a school? Because it's not for everybody and we're all different, and that's where diversity kicks in. So to ask you the question, sort of how do you build that sense of belonging and bring maybe students that aren't quite suited to that environment and have to be at school for a number of years? How do you build those environments, Dunk?
Yeah, so I mean, I know this is something, it's a bit of a buzzword in education at the moment, belonging. So if you want the short version, it happens as a result of COVID. That's the short version. So basically, as I say, I wasn't in New Zealand, and I can't remember the New Zealand approach to lockdown, but over here it was, Boris was on the telly, and we were all getting told I remember sat in this room now, and the telly's over my shoulder, and I remember just sat there, and Boris was like, right, we're shutting everything. And I was like, no way. They're going to shut schools, because schools, as you remember, Stu, never shut. Our school's bought a tractor with a snowplow on the front. It snows once every 15 years in sunny Appleton, right? So the head was paranoid about the school shutting, right? So all of a sudden overnight, the shutters come down and that covenant has been broken with parents. So all of a sudden we went from saying school is the most important thing you are in, I remember my mum saying to me, like, if you can walk, you can go to school. Like, I was like, thanks, mum. We were in every day, weren't we? And then all of a sudden the covenant's broken. So instead of saying to come to school, we said, stay at home. Stay at home, guys. It's safe. And then a year later, we were saying, right, everyone back. And then we're all talking about an attendance crisis. So belonging has been damaged by that, completely damaged. So schools became a place, it kind of, not only did it so for middle class kids, like, I'm not ashamed to say I'm from the mean streets of Bootle, but I am a middle class kid now, and my kids are middle class kids. So when you're talking to middle class kids and families about schools are a way to the next phase of their education in their era. I think with the COVID shutdowns, I think for working class families and certainly families from disadvantaged backgrounds, it just confirmed everything they thought, that really school might not be a place for them. They don't sound like me. The teachers are middle class. They don't sound like me. They talk about 5 years down the line when, 5 years, I know some of these children are thinking about the next 5 minutes. And I think when we talk about belonging, I think we've got a lot of work to do to get that back. And, we can talk about the cultural divides and cultural gaps. We can talk about, the impact of, climate and culture. The number one thing for belonging in school is that kids feel safe. And I think with the way society is at the moment, and, certainly for females, older females in school, so, 15, 16-year-old females, they're the people who say they feel least safe on their way to school, in school, and on their way home from school. And then if you couple that with the powerful message that Boris sent, which was stay home, it's safe, you put those two things together, it's a bit of a deadly combo for belonging. And that's why it's such a hot topic at the moment in schools, Stu, this concept of getting people back. To answer your
I
initial
think
question, I've gone up there. Bit of
no,
a rant.
that's gold. I I'm thinking back 5 years to COVID in New Zealand. So the first time around, start of 2020, and it was a hard lockdown here for about 6 weeks initially, and then obviously we had round two of COVID, and that was kind of more of a light touch, but very similar, like really, really militant in terms of obviously all the procedures and people staying home. So kind of echo that sentiment. I must admit, I did look back into the UK and it kind of seemed a little bit of a lighter touch, or maybe that's just people not conforming over there, but it was very, very militant here and adhering to restrictions, if you like. The other thing that popped into my mind, though, when you were talking about what school was like back in our day, and you did need to be falling over to have a day off school. Generally, you were there 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, and it has seems to have changed a lot. Like obviously, the stories passed down. Back in my day, if you listen to your dad or your granddad talk about school, it was very different to when you went to school. Obviously, I don't even think that culture was maybe spoken about, but it certainly was something that was bubbling under the surface. It was just a different culture. And I felt when I turned up at school at year 7, which was like 11 years old, at high school, you had the fear of God instilled in terms of what you couldn't do. And either that was through the teachers or the bigger kids. Things have changed a lot now. I mean, school environments are a lot different, aren't they?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I remember, school was in in Bootle in the 80s, it was a fairly violent place that ran on fear, the cartel of fear. Anecdotally speaking, like I went to a Catholic brothers school in Liverpool. Don't get me wrong, I loved it, but it was definitely fear that ran through the school. And you're right, it was on both sides of the tracks. We're petrified of the teachers and petrified of the older kids and petrified of getting on the school bus and petrified to go in the toilet. And in that fear was probably some fun, actually, now I think about it. But at any given moment, you could have had a hiding that you wouldn't have deserved. It is different now. I mean, I think, when we talk about the back in the day moments now, and that those ritualistic stories that, create, culture, don't they? Which then in turn create climate. It's a bit different now. Like I was thinking about this on the way home tonight. I think in some ways schools are a lot more serious now. I think the precision of education now, like the amount we know with AI and the amount of assessment we do on the kids, and you can know where a child is, within like a milligram of, progress. That precision's kind of taken a bit of the fun out of school. Even in the 20 years since I've been teaching, it used to be more of a laugh, I think, as a profession. But then that could just be me looking back in the day glasses. Those old iconic teachers, the ones that everyone still talks about when they've been dead for ages. The ones like the superheroes or the supervillains that had nicknames and everyone knew them and they didn't look a day older in 40 years. I don't know whether that's actually true. I don't think schools are, I don't know. I think I think there's certainly more serious places now, which is better for the children. Like, you look at the outcomes some schools get, like, now from, like, they have to have a really challenging intake. Like, some of the results they get for those young people are phenomenal. Like, and they're not like cults. I don't mean like some of the schools I could mention, but won't. They're not cults. They just ran well. You know what I mean? Really, really ran well. And I think we're really lucky in the UK.
I think you can underestimate. Everybody would have a story about school or an experience of school looking back, both good and bad, outside of the home. And you talked about, you feel middle class now, even though you're a working class lad from Bootle and a Liverpool fan. Sorry, I had to get that dig in. But you, everybody's got that background and that relatable story about, you mentioned teachers before and those touch points. And I think we underestimate how important it is, how critical it is to have a good experience and take at least something from your education forward into your adult life. Because it just molds you as a person, doesn't it?
Yeah, that holistic. I mean, I always remember when I started teacher training, I was a deputy head in our school. And I remember him explaining to me, I never thought of it this way until he said it, but he said, you only go through school once. And I was like, yeah, that's why, we've spoken about a book called, the magic of moments and all that, haven't we? We have a responsibility as educators to make sure it's good, like, and not just about English, maths, and science, but a good experience, because you only do it once. And everyone deserves to. Not everyone does get it, by the way, but when I reflect back on my school days, I don't think the teaching was up to much, and I certainly don't remember doing past papers, and I definitely don't even remember doing my GCSEs, and I probably haven't remembered that for years. But when I think about school, the school was full of adults who really cared for us. They probably didn't think we'd amount to much though, but they cared for us. And the communities that we built with our lifelong friends, like you've met lots of my mates from school, lifelong sorts of connections with people.
Starting to conjure up images of the movie Kes with Brian Glover, set in 1970s Barnsley in South Yorkshire, if anybody's seen that movie. It's kind of, we're almost coming across like two Python-esque characters here, aren't we, back in my day?
No, it's true. Like, but back in the day is actually, it's part when we talk about creating culture, those historical, almost mythical figures from your childhood are what, it's like, and for myself now, like I'm teaching kids of people I taught. I'm just waiting for like a grandparent moment and then I'm getting off. That's it. I'm done. But at the moment, yeah, and those mythical and like, it's funny, like, as teachers, we have a responsibility, to the memories of those people as well, because, the first thing anyone ever says to you is they come up to you and go, "Oh, you look exactly the same, sir." And I was like, "Oh my God, did I look 51 when I was 28?" I can't think what's worse. Anyways, but you know what I mean?
I couldn't possibly comment on that, Dunk, but I
Thanks, mate.
think one of the things that I've teased out there really is, how do you balance in school that high expectation? Andy in episode 3 talked about the All Blacks and Silver Ferns and setting expectations and standards. So how do you set those expectations and standards within your school and also have genuine care and empathy for students, but also want the performance from them to obviously achieve and go on to achieve and leave the school in a better place? How do you get that balance right?
So I think, I mean, I often talk to sort of new teachers and trainee teachers, and the first thing you've got to recognise about education, there's not many professions like education whereby if something doesn't quite fit the mould, you can't send it back. So in pro sport, or if you're in engineering, if you've got a batch of steel that has a particular weakness that will make the things that you're looking to create out of that steel less stable, you can send it back and reorder. If you've got a pro sports team like the All Blacks, and I know me and you've spoken about the All Blacks a lot over the years, but if you don't fit the mould, if you're a certain type of person, you can't play. They'll move you on. In education, it's not like that because there's too much at risk, you see. So I know this is the sweet spot question you're talking about here, whereby how do we get the best balance? I would argue that we need to rephrase that question and think, I think there's some things that we know for true. So we know that some children need to be treated differently. Are they a risk to the culture and climate of a school? Well, they can be, or they can be seen as such. Teachers who maybe don't agree with me would say, "Oh, well, Duncan, if you let them behave like that, then others will copy, and then you'll have like this slow rot that gets in, and before you know it, everyone's walking around swearing and not following the rules." In reality, in society don't do that. When you see someone behaving in a way at the football or the rugby that you deem antisocial or unpredictable, you don't copy them. You look at them and think, "Well, I don't want to be like them." And I think, and the point I'm making there is that in education, I think there's too much to risk by looking for a sweet spot between the balancing point. I think ultimately what we've got to do is when we get those students that are unpredictable and that their behaviours are or can be seen to be challenging or difficult, we've got to support them, because if we don't, then we lose them. And I tell you what, when we talk about a culture and a climate, that's made up of a lot of people. And if we turn the climate and the culture against the individual will lose, but the climate will always recover, you see. So from a philosophical point of view and an ethical point of view, I don't think there really is a sweet spot. I think you've just got to look for the need and back the child, I think. That won't be popular, by the way.
it's a good point you make because, like we said before, you're at school for a number of years. I mean, students will obviously move schools, and I think in extreme cases may be expelled from school, which has happened, or suspended. But how do you not get to that point? So talked about building safe environments, engaging environments for students to be part of within the classroom or the school. Do you think that's a fair assessment? That obviously teachers are trying to build safe, fun, engaging environments, so that doesn't happen.
So, there is situations, and they are rare in Britain, where pupils are permanently excluded from school. That is true. And I suppose what I'm not really talking about is those one-off serious incidences, or even those. I think when we talk about, when we look to do the most extreme things in schools, where we put our hands up, we say we can't do anything with this child. I think that in its way can really affect, the values of the school as well. Not saying that you shouldn't. I mean, and I know schools and head teachers do not take BMX lightly. They certainly don't. I think, and most pastoral teams that I work with will see it as a bit of a personal defeat when they lose a child, and, we always say in our place, they're one of ours, like they're us. We need to do everything we can, but sometimes you have no choice and you have to move them on because of the risk, physical risk to people, but the risk to the climate shouldn't be a reason, I don't think, to permanently exclude someone, but people won't always agree with that. I mean, my view is that, the climate will always recover if the teachers and the systems in place are strong to support that culture. But as I say, not everyone would agree with that, Stu.
But so what's the hardest part about building that culture that students and staff want to be a part of, I guess? What are the external and internal challenges that get in the way? And probably a better way of putting it is, if I had a bottomless bag of money for you in terms of building an environment in the school, how would you go about that?
See, it's not, I mean, in schools, like, there is literally no money. So, like, everybody who works in schools is used to, you don't ask for anything because it's just no. And I think a lot of the time, money can't fix those big problems anyway, So if we're talking about those individuals that act in really unpredictable, dangerous ways in school, no matter how much money you've got, doesn't matter. I think when we talk about that connection, that connection with individuals, what is it we need? I think rather than the money that's spent, I think certainly for disadvantaged pupils and connecting, that belonging, we need to sometimes look at maybe what we teach, this idea of a relevant curricula. So, you know, lots of disadvantaged pupils and their families, more importantly, will say, well, what do I need to know that for? I'm never going to use it again. And then we take the middle class view, don't we? Oh, yes, but being able to count with letters is good. Is it though? Is it really good? I'm not suggesting we don't teach them maths. The point I'm making is often that they see school as completely irrelevant, certainly the older they get. And that then becomes an anathema to belonging. So I think, if we were talking about, if we had a bottomless pit, it would certainly be about looking at curriculum and also developing SEN. Because I don't know what you guys call it in New Zealand, so special educational need in the UK. I mean, that is just a bureaucratic machine that spits out kids. It's appalling, the lack of funding within special educational need and the way that schools are set up like a bureaucratic machine, and then are then told by Ofsted that they're not good enough because they haven't got enough resources. And guess what? The resources weren't given to them in the first place by the DfE. It's a fairly horrific situation, I think. And that would be a bottomless pit, by the way. But I would say SEN and a relevant curriculum.
Okay. I threw a quote at you a couple of weeks ago when we had a pre-chat for the podcast. And for the sake of the listener, Edward O. Wilson, the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And it is terrifically dangerous, and it is now approaching a point of crisis overall. I think, to go back to our question before, it was different when we were at school, but we do have these institutions called schools, and you have to attend, mostly whether you like it or not. Within the schools, the leaders, the teachers and managers, obviously, I think in terms of teaching, teachers and education has moved on drastically over the years. And one of the buzzwords in culture in and around culture since 1995 and the Dan Goleman stuff about emotional intelligence. How emotionally intelligent are teachers now, understanding of emotional regulation, self-awareness, communication, social skills? Would you say that's really moved on, and an understanding of the whole, you mentioned the whole human being before, and engaging with people on a human level? Do you think that's really important within school culture?
It comes down to, doesn't it? I mean, emotional intelligence, it's a huge part of relationships, isn't it? Being able to be able to shape shift in your relationship building, amongst different types of children and their families is essential. But you know what? In schools, good routines will get you a long way. Like, you know, I know lots of teachers that you wouldn't necessarily have them out as being like emotional intelligent gurus, but can get by. Like, I think for those exceptional individuals that change kids' lives, you are talking about emotional intelligence, and the big part, I know you'll know this, Stu, as well, and you'll probably agree with me, a big part of emotional intelligence is empathy, eh? So empathy is just such a huge part. When you look at the word family of empathy, so you've got sympathy, apathy, empathy, haven't you? Like, as a kid from a disadvantaged background, I don't want sympathy. I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me. You know what I mean? In fact, I'd rather you were apathetic. I'd rather have apathy. What I want is, I want empathy, don't I? I want you to look at me and think, "Do you know what? Imagine what it must be like to be him." And then I'll go that extra mile for them, and then they'll go that extra mile for you. So when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's empathy. But then when you look at it in schools, when you haven't got that, certainly from a leadership point of view, that can be really dangerous, right? So, end up with people working in silos, don't you? That sort of, I'm working on my own, to my own agenda. It's like, it's an anathema to team building and culture. And then that breaks down into communication as well. So I would say, communication and empathy are the big drivers for me of emotional intelligence. They're completely essential. Mate, you can get away with the classroom of just being a good routine guy, but for school leadership, you've got to be all over it. Got to be all over it.
And as a leader in your space, when you have new teachers coming in, what would your advice be to them coming into sort of your environment and trying to get through the first year and not feeling overwhelmed? How would you advise them, and what advice would you give them, having been a new teacher yourself and now in a management position?
Yeah, so I always, as I alluded to you a couple of weeks ago, I've been doing lecturing for the ITT program, which is initial teacher training. So when you're a new teacher, the only thing that you're really bothered about is the kids behaving. That's the only thing that, they do essays on all kinds about assessment. And the only thing that really keeps them awake at night is when they say, do something, the kids just laugh at them. It's like that dream you have, when you wake up and you're doing an assembly and all your teeth have fell out. But so, it's really overwhelming for new teachers. And I think it's what I always say to my children as well. It's just like, don't try and do everything all at once. Was it Muhammad Ali who said, it's not the mountain in front of you, it's the stone in the shoe that'll kill you. It's that little bit, taking those little moments a day at a time, and it's about, if we're talking about tips for the classroom, it's about creating that psychological safety in the classroom for the kids, setting up your environment so it's yours, and making sure that there might as well be a big neon sign outside any teacher's classroom that says, Mr. Savage's classroom, don't mess me about, because this is my space. Because I always say to the, trainee teachers, like, every group of primates will have an alpha. And if it's not you, who is it? And it's normally the loudest kid who's got too much to say, rocks on his chair and chews. That's what I would say. The most important thing is about having the 3 R's, setting up that space that is yours and you own it. Like,
I do remember asking you for some advice. I think I was teaching over in Manchester. Would have been 2007, 8 and 9. Started a job over there at FE College and put in a bit of routine in and around the classroom. And I remember you saying, like, obviously get them lined up outside. And FE is a little bit different, isn't it? It's like sixth form here, and you're obviously at secondary, which would be years 7 to 11, where you are predominantly. But that did help in terms of kind of create the environment and a little bit of structure for the students coming into and what I found quite useful was to give them some ownership as well in terms of building their own culture within the group. So I would have stock standard rules, probably 5 or 6 that I expected, but then to get them to create some and actually build their own ownership and accountability of how they want it to look. And obviously I would oversee it, but just to give them a little bit of responsibility and ownership of their own environment, I think went a long way. And that's certainly the same within the workplace. I think if leaders, CEOs, and managers obviously give that opportunity to develop the culture and set the example, but the people who are doing the work, the teams need to drive it. And if they can feel that they are part of it and own it, I think in terms of human behavior, if you're invested in something, you're more likely to look after it. Do you think that's a fair assessment in schools as well?
Yeah, I mean, something that I don't even think we've mentioned so far is the importance of reward. We often talk about sanction in schools, but actually reward, and reward's got a huge part to play in school culture, hasn't it? The fact that if you do the right thing and you're seen to be doing the right thing, then, you will be rewarded for that. And that comes back to that relational practice as well, catching a kid doing something right, you know. There's a very famous video by an American guy who I can't remember the name of, which is a bit rubbish, but he talks about the importance of poker chips, in self-esteem. So whenever you speak to a child, you should make sure that they get more poker chips from you than you take away. So if you're talking about the lining up outside your classroom analogy and little Stu Savage hasn't got his blazer on. And one of my rules in my classroom is you can't come into my classroom unless you're dressed properly. So young Stu tries to get in and I go, whoa, whoa, Stu, blazer on, please. I've taken 7 poker chips. I've made an object of this blazer and I've done it in front of his peers. So I've taken 7 poker chips off him, but before he goes past me, I'm going to make sure that he knows that I'm going to thank him for that. And I'm going to say, thank you for being part of my class. It's really important that you're here. So I give him 20 poker chips. So he's 13 up. And hypothetically speaking, of course. So that's the role of every adult who works in schools. I believe, it's not only just about these relationships we have, but it's about taking every opportunity to really smash home this idea of self-esteem and the more poker chips you've got, the more self-esteem you've got. The more self-esteem you've got, the more risks you're going to take in the classroom. The learners that take the most risks are the ones that get the most reward. And it's that side of school culture and climate that we've not really touched upon, but is actually really key in setting the tone for schools. It isn't telling people, it's catching people doing the right thing and then praising and rewarding
So it's positive and negative reinforcement, and you're more on the side of giving those 20 poker chips as part of positive reinforcement, because you obviously
But you
see.
can only do that. You can only do that though if you're good with relationships. Because if you get it wrong, I mentioned before Paul Dix, when he spoke about the idea of botheredness. He's also got a really large section in his book, and I'll send you this, Stu, if you've never heard of it. But this idea of emotional currency, so you can spend big, but you've got to build up your credit. So with little Stewie Savage, hasn't got his blazer on, he doesn't like me. He knows I don't like him. I tell him to put his blazer on, he says no. I've lost a load of face in front of the class. He doesn't care because he doesn't like me. We only do things for people we like. You can see how the loop goes on. But this idea of emotional currency, the fact that we build up poker chips with people, and when we've got a lot, we can spend big, but we ain't got much, we can't. So that it gets you to that sort of, you get to the situation whereby some students who haven't got many poker chips, for example, they don't play for the school rugby league team. They didn't go to prom. They'll either do one or two things. They'll either gamble big and throw all the chips on the table at once, or they'll keep hold of the chips and won't spend at all. Either situation's negative.
I think that's sound advice just in life, really, isn't it, as well? Understanding human behavior. And I think that's probably where we're coming back to is what is culture to you within your environment? And certainly something I keep coming back to is it's basically how we think and behave. And if we can understand the people in our environment, whether it's work or school or wherever, at the sports team, then we're in a better position to understand how to get the best out of them, especially if you're in a leadership position. And I think that's something that you've really hit home on, though, is just around positive and negative reinforcement. Okay, closing with some wit and wisdom. I've got a note here, Duncan, on my script. I'm going to give you some questions, and we'll start to conclude. So if culture is the glue of a school, what's the solvent that eats away at it? I think we've probably answered some of that already.
I would say inconsistent leadership. Do you want me to expand on that? No, it's, it's the, yeah, it's the, it's all the stuff we learn about, leadership. We both enjoyed that book Legacy about the All Blacks, didn't we? And the 15 rules of leadership from the Maori culture, and that idea of, if you're not going to do it yourself, don't expect anyone else to do it. And that is the definition of toxic school culture at every level. You know what I mean? That idea that I say you do, it just kills culture, it kills schools. And because that creates that, well, he doesn't do it, but he expects us to do it. And the kids, it just creates fear and loathing amongst every tier of the school, internal and external partners. I've said too much.
Well, that's good. That's good. It's gold, mate. So what's the cliche about school culture that makes you roll your eyes? Something either parents or other teachers come out with, or what's the one thing that you think, God?
It is to do with culture indirectly, but because I do a lot of work with new teachers, the person in the staff room, that when you've got a young teacher at first or second year of teaching, and they mention a really difficult pupil in the staff room, and then some know-it-all says, oh, they're all right for me. And I always just think, why would you say that to someone who's just started teaching? What does that confirm? That they're rubbish at teaching, you're the best. It's this kind of Jedi type skill that only you have. I just feel like, well, I don't feel like rolling my eyes, Stu. I can't tell you what I feel like doing. That's the worst thing you ever hear in school.
I think that's probably a fundamental lack of understanding around diversity. Obviously, different teachers have different skills, don't they? And they'll have different relationships with different students. It's certainly like
for young teachers and colleagues, it's just like, it just confirms what they already feel when you come into teaching, like any job. Teaching's unique because you can't have bad days, because every living paid moment is in front of 30 people, and you're on your own as well. I remember when I done my teacher training years ago, I got this sort of lecturer who was a bit of a dinosaur, but he had some funny one-liners. And he always said to me, he said, well, on the last day, he said, I'll give you me advice on the last lesson. So we had our last lecture, and someone put their hand up and said, what was your last bit of advice? And he said, 30 of them, there's one of you. If they wanted to, they could kill you. And I remember, and then it just walked out. And it's always stayed with me. I love it. That's not putting people off, by the way.
It's one funny story I had teaching over in Manchester. There was a guy in our department, and he'd been to another college, and he was being assessed, and I think they were doing football. This may have been over in Oldham, and the inspector or the observer said to him, where's your lesson plan? And he said, I don't have a lesson plan. He said, well, how do you know what's going to happen in the lesson? And he said, I've got 30 footballs, and I want to make sure all of them 30 come back and nobody has a fight, and that's my objective for the lesson. And I thought, wow, like education must have moved on since then, but it kind of summed up like where his head was at and the environment and culture that he was in at the time. Going back to, again, that movie Kes, it was a bit like that. So what's the one left field idea in culture that we're not talking about, Dunk, or in education? What's the one thing that you've seen, a light bulb moment that you think to yourself, we need more of that?
That's a good question, that. So I've kind of touched upon it. I'm spending a bit of time at the moment working with our trust on developing belonging, because of sort of the impact that sort of disengaged, disadvantaged pupils have. And I think the most important thing for me at the moment is how we get the adults in the classroom, with all the pressure that's put on them. And I did say before, the fun's kind of been taken out of teaching a bit, how we continually develop self-esteem in young people. I've touched upon poker chips. That was one of the most powerful videos I watched. I will send you the link for that, Stu. But yeah, the most powerful thing, I think, for belonging in a post-COVID school landscape for me is developing self-esteem.
What does that look like? How do you do that?
The smell of self-esteem, right, is the feeling that you get when children love being in school. And that, when you get that, and they're in every day, and they love being there, and they're not just there because they know they've got to, or, whatever. And they know that they're coming there for all the reasons that we've outlined and rehearsed. I think that's the most powerful thing. That the smell of self-esteem. I can't think of a better way of putting it. Smells like a good aftershave, that.
It does. You should be in marketing, not teaching, mate.
Thanks, mate. Well, I'm only 51.
To finish this sentence, one of our last questions for the podcast is always like this stock standard question, trying to tease out what culture looks like for people. So school culture works best when you can finish that sentence, or you can choose culture is ...
Culture. I think I'm going to go culture is. So the sentence is, culture is the development of belonging for all pupils in school.
Excellent. And on that note, I'm going to say to you, Duncan, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast, the Culture 360 podcast, and have the time and knowledge that you've basically imparted with us. There's a lot of teachers and principals, educators that have reached out around this podcast, both in New Zealand, back in the UK, obviously really keen to draw the learnings out of it firstly, but to listen to some of the stories in education that you've shared with us today. It's been awesome. So thank you for coming on the podcast and your time. It's been amazing. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Stu.
If you enjoyed the Culture 360 podcast, and like me, you geek out on leadership and organizational culture, then please smash a like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, if you have any feedback or ideas, or you'd like to get in touch, then please connect with the Culture Room at thecultureroom.co.nz or on our various social media platforms. Thanks for listening.